people or, all older trans Americans or whatever. We share certain characteristics and experiences, but we don't have the same ideas, and we're not all the same. So please just keep that in your hearts and minds. And I am clearly the elder on the panel. So I'm going to offer kind of a longer perspective in trans and queer history, and sort of something to compare what has changed and what still needs to be changed. I was born in Oakland, California, on the unceded ancestral territory of the Ohlone people. And almost all my life has been spent on unceded indigenous territories of a variety of colonized people. Right now I'm on the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh territories. I just want to start by saying that I owe these nations a debt that I can never repay. And I am dedicated to reconciliation, and personally I'm dedicated to giving land back. And I pray for the day when true reconciliation can come about. So in the 1950s, I'm absolutely certain that the phrase or concept gender dysphoria, which is one of the terms used to describe transsexuality, that it didn't even exist. I was a little kid growing up in an era when not only was there no internet, there were no gay papers, no queer bookstores, no queer studies departments in universities, no gay straight alliances in high school, no pride parade. This was a time before there were any of the visible movements that have become such fixtures and forces in our lives. There was no high profile feminist movement, no La Raza, no environmental movement, no American Indian movement. There wasn't even a movement against the Vietnam War yet, which really didn't start appearing in the community where I grew up until I left it, if ever. There were underground movements and solidarity among oppressed peoples, as there always are, but there was no prominent LGBTQ movement that I could have found out about in my small California town. Now, there was a growing civil rights movement. And in fact, I would say that that movement inspired the ones to follow. But its courageous battles and hard-won victories were happening far away from where I was living. Beyond nightly stories on the TV news, the immediate effects of this organized fight against legalized segregation barely penetrated the small working class, mostly white neighborhoods where I was living. For young people today, I think it's impossible or almost impossible to imagine just how casually sexist, racist, and conformist, not to mention virulently homophobic, the milieu I was born into and grew up in was. I understand that for many people, the 1950s and 1960s may be remembered as happy days. But for people like me who were different, who didn't fit into the mainstream, or for one reason or another, were just not white and middle class and of a particular background, it was a challenging time. And I personally don't really have any nostalgia for that time period. And likewise, of course, there was no sex education in the schools. The very idea of sex education in the schools would have horrified people. No one ever talked about sex. My mother didn't even tell me about the basics of reproduction until I was 13 or 14. And that conversation was so crudely and poorly done that thinking back on it now shocks me. As for gender, the universal belief was that there were two and only two genders, that they were immutable and determined at birth by physical characteristics. So I'm sharing all this not to elicit sympathy, but to establish the setting in which I was trying to understand what I was feeling. My confusion, if you will, in this insular and reticent and repressive environment, as I tried to establish who I was and to understand why I felt so different. But without words or vocabulary, I really had no way to articulate or conceptualize what I was feeling. I simply knew that I preferred boys' clothes, boys' company, the way that boys and men moved through my environment. I emulated the men in my life, not the women. And I felt the most comfortable talking and moving and relating in the ways that they did. But where this all fit into the larger scheme of things, I had no idea. People treated me as a tomboy. And eventually, I internalized a simple, but at the time, and maybe even for this time, subversive equation. I concluded that some boys had that particular piece of anatomy that we determine masculinity by, and that some didn't, and that I was one of the ones who didn't. But I never quit looking for others like me. But I also never shared that belief with anyone. I didn't even articulate it to myself until years after I started living as a man. The conclusion just remained deep in my psyche, kind of an unspoken and unexamined assumption that somehow kept my masculine identity alive as I navigated what was an increasingly stricter gender policing that occurs to tomboys or occurred to tomboys in the era I grew up as I entered into my teenage years. Another reason I'm sharing these particular details is to emphasize the vital necessity for radical progressive movements and a radically affirmative and progressive church. Given the intersectionality of class, race, economics, and gender, and more, we really must work together in movements and forge solidarity among our communities if we're going to bring about the kingdom of God on earth. The dominant power structure, the Roman Empire, if you will, is very adept at dividing us, and we really must not let it. As for my religious journey, I was raised Irish Roman Catholic, and one bright light in my childhood was Vatican II. It was called when I was 10 years old. And the reforms that emerged under Pope John the 23rd and his allies, they lit a spiritual fire in me and kindled an early sense of vocation. Back then, the only option that seemed open was to become a nun. And considering how radically awesome so many Catholic nuns are, I think I may have found myself in the best of company. But in my small community, many Catholics, including some in my family, resisted the reforms of Vatican II. And as I progressed from 5th through 9th grade in Catholic school, my visceral and personal and mystical experience of God that was very grounded in the geography and the flora and the fauna of the watershed that I was living in the Southern California coast at the time. It began to clash with this sort of authoritarian Catholicism that I was encountering everywhere else. And that Catholicism was very focused on catechism and guilt and sexual sin and a very literal interpretation of scripture. As a result, my enthusiasm and my faith were already faltering when tragedy struck in my life. 10 weeks after my 17th birthday, my mom committed suicide using a handgun. And my life was just turned upside down. My faith evaporated in an instant when I walked into the room where I found her. And in the days and the weeks and the years that followed, I simply couldn't reconcile how an all-powerful and loving God who watched over our every move could let something like this happen. In the aftermath, the church alienated me further by making an issue of whether or not she could be buried in consecrated ground. And assent was eventually given by the Monsignor of our parish, who I found out years later, in the time before my mom's death, had been having sex with a young man I was close to. He was not a minor at the time, but the huge difference in age and maturity and experience, not to mention the hypocrisy and the secrecy and the lies, only further estranged me from the church of my birth. So after the funeral, I started avoiding church, and worse, the Eucharist, which has always meant so much to me. Eventually, I left Roman Catholicism altogether, and the trauma of my mom's suicide and its aftermath also caused me to bury any and all feelings of being a boy for at least 20 years. I simply couldn't handle any more difficulties in my life. And even nowadays, coming out as trans creates difficulties, as I'm sure you'll hear from the people who are speaking after me. Years of therapy slowly healed my wounds, and eventually I came to address the issues of my identity. First, I came out as queer, and then nearly a decade later as trans. By that time, I had left the small towns where I grew up, and I traveled the world a bit. And I ended up in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I was blessed to witness the heady and the radical days of San Francisco's queer community. I was there when, for the heydays of Polk Street and Castro, and Harvey Milks, he was elected to the Board of Supervisors, and then he was assassinated 11 months later. I lived through the horrific scourge of AIDS in San Francisco Bay Area, but I also marched in the first female to male trans contingent in the San Francisco LGB, there was no T yet, Pride Parade. The year was about 1994-5. Our contingent was 10 or 12 people strong. And it was pretty clear that pretty much everyone along the parade route had no idea what our banner FTM International stood for, but they cheered us nonetheless. So FTM stands for female to male, and the support group I transitioned with was founded by the now famous Lou Sullivan. Although sadly, I joined the group 9 months after Lou died of AIDS, so I never had a chance to meet him. But I did transition with some amazing people who are still my friends, including history makers like Jameson Green and Susan Stryker, Lauren Cameron, and Kate Bornstein. I even met and had burritos once with the incredible Leslie Feinberg. And if you don't know who she is, I suggest you look her up. Or I shouldn't say she, I'm sorry. I'm not sure what pronoun Leslie was comfortable with, but I'll use they. And they were truly amazing. Like, they deserve every accolade that they get. They were an incredible person. So as all this was happening, though, America's self-styled moral majority and the religious right were steadily ascending into political power. And as they did, the LGBT plus community became one of their go-to targets. You can track the increase in newspaper articles during the years that included terms like gay agenda and homosexual threat, and eventually the words transgender and bathroom. The sort of toxic public discourse that developed and still prevails, in my experience, has a measurable and damaging effect on queer and trans people. Personally, I felt like I had a target on my back, and most of the people wielding the weapons triumphantly called themselves Christians. In my own family and social circle, I witnessed firsthand the spiritual trauma caused by homophobia and transphobia and misogyny. It's not theoretical or academic for me, it's people. It's people I know, people who have been deeply hurt, and some people who are no longer with us as a result of the hatred. By the time I began to be drawn back toward the faith of my childhood, well, towards Christianity, the religious right had so thoroughly poisoned the public discourse for me in America that I had to transplant myself to Canada in order to feel comfortable studying theology in a Christian seminary. So a lot has changed for the better in my lifetime, but before we congratulate ourselves, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this as we continue, I'd like to remind us that trans people remain the targets of horrific rates of violence and murder across the globe. We're 2 days before the Trans Day of Remembrance, and trans women of color in particular, but also trans and non-binary people of all ethnicities and genders experience typically higher than average rates of suicide, mental illness, poverty, homelessness, addiction, and all the other markers of systemic oppression. And all of that's related to the fact that we're gender nonconforming. Even I, a white, highly educated, privileged North American, man that most people wouldn't know was trans. I've been forced from 2 jobs on 2 separate continents when my supervisors found out I was trans. The second time hurt the most because I'd worked at the company for 3 years, received glowing reviews, bonuses and raises, and really liked the people before they found out I was trans. And then literally from one day to the next, I could do nothing right. Everything changed, and I was criticized for everything that I did until I finally resigned 6 months later, a nervous wreck, actually. Which brings me to a third reason I'm sharing my story. I feel like we must talk more openly in the church and elsewhere about all this. And to do so, I think it would help to have openly trans, non-binary, and queer clergy members. I'm not just saying this because I want to be one, but we need people to lead, to open and to lead the conversations, and to show young trans, non-binary, and queer people that we truly are an affirming church. I belong to the Anglican Church now of Canada. But as you know, Anglican canon law still defines marriage as between a man and a woman. And I will never forget the anguish of young queer church members when last year's synod vote was determined. And only this past week, some of you will know this because you were there too, I attended a required online class on the subject of Anglican marriage. And for me, it was like enduring 10 hours of liturgy and discussions that reminded me over and over again of my outsider status within the communion. Yes, we are a minority within the church, but does the majority really suffer or lose anything intrinsic by adopting a standard inclusive liturgy? Does the majority lose by acknowledging and respecting relationships beyond the privileged dyad of a man and a woman? After that class, as resilient as I am, I felt so othered and erased that doubts were niggling at the edge of my consciousness whether I really belong here or not. This happened the same week that for the first time I met an out trans Anglican priest, and thank you, Rob, for that. And maybe there are more, I don't know, I haven't encountered any yet, but after we talked, I was surprised at how emotional I was feeling. I'm on a priestly ordination track, and for the first time after talking with this person, I began to really feel like it might be possible. So the church is letting our young people down. They need this, but it's not only them. It's the church needs this. The gifts that trans and queer people bring to the church are so numerous and so relevant, not just for people like us, but for everyone. Particularly during this time of change when so much is uncertain, it's not just our resilience, our insight, and our abilities to think outside the box. It's that we embody messages of hope and transformation. As a trans friend once pointed out, many, if not all of us, know viscerally what it's like to die and be resurrected. So to conclude, even recognizing all that has changed for the better and grateful to live here in what may be the most progressive Anglican diocese in the world, I'd like to point out that we wouldn't even really be having this panel tonight if we don't need to do more. Maybe instead we'd be discussing something more fascinating like insights from having lived as both a man and a woman in a society that is so divided still on gender lines. In short, I'm tired of being othered. I'm tired of being viewed as a sort of problem to be addressed, whether it's in practical terms around bathrooms and, you know, renovations to the church, or in liturgical or doctrinal terms. I wish we could just move beyond these issues. And I wish I could convey to you what it feels like to be at the center of these contentious battles. Battles which really the question is whether we have the right to simply live fully as others do, to duck into a washroom when we're caught short in public, to marry in the church the people we love, to adopt children, to follow a call into ministry, and more. But I don't really know how to convey the full emotional impact of that. But what I believe is that God, the God we know and worship, understands. That same trans friend I mentioned earlier also pointed out to me that Jesus knows what it's like to transition. In the Lord's case, it was from spirit into a human body, a physical human body. My friend went on to say that the wonder Jesus must have felt at this remarkable transformation might be akin to what trans people feel when we're finally allowed to live our authentic lives. And I'll end by just saying, pondering all this, I really can't help but believe that Jesus wants us fully and totally accepted into this church. Thank you.
Thank you, Brynn, for the vulnerability, the honesty, the power of your story. I won't say more. There's much I would love to say in response, but I won't say more. Just we'll take a moment, as we said, in silence and stillness, and then Danny's going to share with us in about a minute. Okay, I'm going to invite Danny to share at this time. Okay.
Kind of like a hard act to follow there, but in Brené's book, The Gift of Imperfection, she writes, "Owning our story and loving ourselves through the process is the bravest thing we'll ever do." It's both an honor and a privilege to be asked here by Reverend Rob here at the Abbey and Zoom along with Reverend Junia and Brynn and all of you tonight. Never in a million years did I think I would ever step back into a church after the way the LGBTQ community have been treated by many Christians and other religious people. Over the past 30 years or so, I've studied other religions, and even to this day, I don't label myself as a Christian. I consider myself to be a spiritual person, and I'm on a spectrum when it comes to religion and spirituality. There isn't just one way. My earliest memories of church are going to worship with my parents and siblings every Sunday morning, no ifs, ands, or buts. I remember my father would be asked every now and then to give a sermon. He was a police officer. And so I'm thrilled and honored today to be following in his footsteps. At that time, church was just a building to me. It wasn't until my later years that I really understood that church is not a building, it is the people. Just a little less than 3 years ago, I was at a church service here at the Abbey, located in Victoria, a wonderful community of people that are kind, loving, and inclusive. The Reverend Rob informed the congregation that we were coming into the season of Lent and explained that Lent had traditionally been a time when folks had chosen to be baptized, and he invited people to be baptized if they hadn't already. After hearing the announcements, I had a conversation with Reverend Anita and asked her if I could be rebaptized, and if so, would she be willing to do it? In short, she replied, "You have always been a child of God, and he has always known you and loved you just as you are." Those were some powerful words. After several conversations with Reverends Anita, Rob, and Megan, we all agreed that I was worthy of having a baptismal remembrance and name-changing ceremony. Together with dear friends, my family, and the Abbey folks, we celebrated and reaffirmed that God has always loved me and seen me. I must say, though, that there were a lot of surprise and shock from a number of my LGBTQ friends and others. "You go to church? You're a Christian?" "Yes, I go to church, and you can too." There are many versions of my story that I've been working on, but this is the one I chose with you tonight. In many ways, I feel like I'm an invisible man competing in a marathon, and the finish line keeps moving farther out of my reach. No sooner do I overcome one challenging obstacle that I'm faced with yet another. You see, I'm a person living with multiple barriers, and throughout my lifetime, I've had a history of not being believed. When people look at me, they can't see that I have invisible disabilities. They don't know that I'm hearing impaired. They don't know how difficult it is to co-parent effectively with my children's other parent. They also don't know that I was diagnosed with PTSD shortly after the birth of my twin sons. One of my sons had a spontaneous brain hemorrhage shortly after his birth, which required him to spend a tremendous amount of time in the NICU. And as a result, he has several special or unique needs. These needs require me to be constantly advocating and navigating government policies and the medical and education systems to this day. There are a multitude of appointments and diagnostics that are ongoing for him, while at the same time, I'm coping with my own disabilities, mental health, and transition. All this creates a lot of stress and anxiety. When I was born, I was assigned female at birth because of the appearance of the outside of my body, namely my genitals. I was raised and socialized as female. I was baptized as Lutheran. I was attracted to females, therefore, I assumed and identified as lesbian at the age of 19, and probably a whole lot younger, but I didn't know there was a label for it. And since then, I've realized that labels are just for jars. At that point, I was still living with my parents, and I came out. I was told that I must move out of our family home. My mother disowned me and told me that she did not have a daughter any longer and that she dreamt my funeral and that I was dead to her. At that time, being LGBTQ was not accepted at the church and probably not for most religions. I remember my father secretly calling me from work to check in on me. At one point, they called a family meeting so that they could gather, my parents and siblings, to tell me how they felt about me, which wasn't positive. Needless to say, I had a harsh and painful transition into adulthood, when young adults seem to need the most guidance, support, and assurance. Sometimes I'm amazed that I'm still here on this earth. I'm happy to report, though, that my family did eventually come around and have supported me ever since. I had many short-term relationships in my 20s and 30s, and I suppose that's quite typical for young adults. In my 30s, I decided I wanted to be a parent. I took an adoption course, a foster parent course, and began fertility treatments as a single female. After a couple of years of trying to get pregnant in a variety of ways, I finally got pregnant via IVF. Sadly, I miscarried. After my third attempt with IVF, which also failed, I met a woman. We became partners and she offered to help me. On our first attempt with IVF together, I tested positive for a twin pregnancy. If you know of anyone who's had a twin pregnancy, you'll know that they aren't fun. Shortly after the birth of our children, my partner and I separated at about 10 months. At the age of 44, I gave birth to healthy children. Just over 6 years ago, what I thought was a rare form of breast cancer resulted in me in coming out as a transgendered male. Many people think that being trans and transitioning is all about surgeries and body parts. Although that's part of it, for some of us, it's not most of it. I have been told many times that I'm brave and courageous, which I actually think is true. However, I feel like I've spent an awful lot of time learning how to socially function to fit in. It took me a while to realize that I don't actually want to fit in. I want to belong. It hasn't been about changing who I am. It's about refining who I am without apology. I am a trans person and will not be erased. I've been going to counseling and doing an awful lot of personal work over the past few years. I have learned that I'm a remarkable human being who happens to be highly sensitive, empathic, strong, and caring. I am resilient and resourceful, yet I still struggle with the long-standing belief that I'm not good enough. Perhaps some of you may relate. While it's a privilege to be both mom and dad to my boys, there are even more expectations and responsibilities for me to meet as a parent. And sometimes I feel I have a responsibility to apologize for all the questionable forms of white cisgendered men before me who have modeled inappropriate behaviors and attitudes about how to be male. This is a real challenge for me. And so I'm committed to teach my boys that self-care is vital for everyone who wants to be healthy, and it's more than okay to be vulnerable, compassionate, kind, and uniquely different from others. Now that I know that I do have value and that I am worthy, but most of all, I have come to know that I'm enough. Some people have asked me why, after all this time, would I would choose to transition so late in life. My answer has always been, I owe it to my children to live an honest and happy life. Because I am experienced with more than one gender, I am more conscientious of my language. However, I will still react in more female and feminine ways than a cis male, a person who is okay with the gender they were assigned at birth. I am looking at experiencing life through a different set of lenses, somewhat like a superpower. Many of my experiences are enriching, and rewarding, but I've also had a lot of challenges. If someone was to ask me if I could do my life all over again, I'd say it hasn't been an easy road. But it's the only road, the right road for me. I may be lacking in having most people on board and in support and get it, but I know that I'm living and loving authentically. There isn't anything easy about living authentically. As you probably know, children ask difficult questions. Very recently during COVID-19, my son asked me why I would even return to church after being away for so many years. We've had many conversations about church over the past couple of years. He has learned in school about how Christians have treated Indigenous people. I've talked to him about reconciliation and that when we know better, we do better. I've explained to him that's what many Christians and other people are doing all over the world, even with the LGBTQ people. Shortly after the birth of my children, I thought that I couldn't possibly raise my children alone. I was so overwhelmed, but then I started taking my babies to the Grace Lutheran Church here in Victoria, and the people there took turns holding my children and praying for us. They were so kind. Pastor Brenda baptized my children, and during that time, I met several amazing people with very kind hearts, and we become and still are friends to this day. Several years have gone by now, and we are currently attending the Abbey, and one of my sons helps with communion. And we continue to be supported by our faith community. Often at the services, you'll find me sitting or standing near the back of the church for parts of the service. It's then when I feel safe enough to let my guard down and count my blessings, which is almost always accompanied by tears. Church has now become a safe place for me to relax and show up with all my imperfections. I always leave the church feeling uplifted, connected, loved, worthy, and supported. At times, I have been so angry with God. I've questioned many people of faith and asked why God chose to lead me down this path for my life. I've often thought there must be some sort of higher purpose for me. I've come to realize that although I've had so many challenges, I've had many more incredible blessings, and that's not the experience of many LGBT people. I feel incredibly lucky to be blessed with two beautiful children and a village of people have chosen to walk alongside of us. I have been blessed with so many gifts and have become such a strong and resilient human being. I've accomplished and overcome some very hard things in my life, and I'm grateful for my privilege. And I've made a promise to myself and God that I will use my privilege for the good of humanity. In closing, my wish for you tonight is that that you would consider these final words. Love your neighbor who doesn't look like you, think like you, love like you, speak like you, pray like you, vote like you. Love your neighbor, no exceptions. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you, Danny. I've heard your story a few times now, and it becomes richer and deeper each time. So thank you for sharing. Let's again just take a moment to rest in Danny's story and just take that moment together. Okay, so I'm going to now invite June to share her story. So welcome. And just before June speaks, I should say what time we're at 8 here. So it's 11 o'clock there. So thank you for holding in there and being the last person to speak. It's late in so
it occurs to me that not only am I following two people who are just done an extraordinary job and who have been out more than 5 months, like me, and have stories to tell, but it's 11 o'clock here. So who knows what this is going to look like for the next couple of minutes. I honestly don't. But hello from Mississauga. My name is June Joplin. I was the only kid at South Caldwell High School in Hudson, North Carolina, who wore a Vancouver Canucks jersey to school. And it was the old skate logo. I used to look up articles about Pavel Bure and Trevor Linden on microfiche in the school library. And that's not frivolous because hockey plays a very important role in my story towards self-acceptance. So I'll get to that in just a second. But like I said, I've been out for 5 months. I came out to the world on June the 14th. I socially transitioned about 8 months ago. This is so new to me. And in some ways, it's kind of ridiculous that I'm being expected to tell my story as often and as widely as I am. I had some friends before I came out who said, you know what? For some reason, newly out people often get a lot of attention, and it's sometimes it's not fair. But I had a friend who said to me, she's a trans woman in Utah, and she dealt a little bit with the media when she came out, and she said, well, you're white, you're pretty, you've got sort of a public job, you should be ready for the Canadian version of Good Morning America to call you. And I thought, that's ridiculous, but she was right. And so I've kind of been living in that whirlwind for the past several months. One fairly prominent LGBTQ plus activist and legal expert here in Ontario likes to refer to me as an accidental activist. My best friend says to me sometimes, June, you make perfect sense to me as a woman, but no sense at all as a member of the LGBTQ plus community. You know, I'm a suburban white lady. I take my kids to hockey. Yeah, I lived here in Toronto for almost 5 years before I ever visited the village church in Wellesley. And yeah, I live a pretty, I don't know, it's a strange existence that this is where I am. But I was born actually on the day that Harvey Milk was assassinated, November 27th, 1978, on the other side of the country in North Carolina. I grew up in a Baptist church there in a small town church that was proudly fundamentalist. We wore that wasn't a label somebody else gave us. That was a label that we wore very proudly. And I grew up going to that church 6 days a week. Twice on Sundays, once on Wednesday, and then every other weekday for school. They ran kind of a fundamentalist Christian school with curriculum out of like Bob Jones University, etc. And I grew up in that environment. I remember I was telling somebody this the other day. Maybe one of the first senses that there was something kind of off about my sense of gender was in kindergarten, when I guess I was about 5 years old. And for one afternoon in kindergarten, I had a girlfriend, which was not by choice. It was just one of the other girls in class. For some reason, saw me and chose me, and I spent the afternoon as her girlfriend. And what that meant in those days was just you spent free playtime together. And so in what would have been otherwise been a very gendered time, I sat on the side of the room with the other girls. And we talked about Cabbage Patch Kids, and I was fascinated. And it's so hard to explain, and it's kind of even hard to remember because it's been so long ago. But there was just this sense that I was on the right side of the room. By age 11, I was new into the youth group, and we went away to summer camp on an island in upstate New York. And during that week, I had two huge kind of revelations that changed the course of my life. I realized that I wanted to be a pastor. I interacted enough with my youth that week and the weeks leading up to that week to realize that, here was somebody who was helping me to feel as if I belonged, as if I were a beloved child of God. And I wanted to do that. I wanted to do that work. And the other revelation I had sleeping in a cabin on the boys' side of the island that week was that I was on the wrong side of the island. And so I came home knowing I'm supposed to be a preacher, I'm supposed to be a girl. And I knew that there was one of those revelations that I could share with my family and my church and my pastor and my youth group, and one of those that I just had to hide. I described this kind of dual, I have always kind of understood my sense of vocation and my sense of gender similarly. They're hard to describe. It's just a sense that you have, and it's real, and it changes your life, but it is difficult to put into words. I think on some level they're both matter of faith. I described it to my therapist once as if like these two pieces of me were like holes in a dam, and they were just far enough apart that I could put my hand over one, but I couldn't reach the other one. So I could tend, or if you want to think of them as like open wounds, which is a little less pleasant a metaphor, but I could tend to one but not the other. So I chose ministry, and I spent a number of years from 11 years old when I preached my first sermon in my little Baptist church as a kid, all the way up until my mid-30s, crafting this kind of pastor persona. I've been thinking a lot about the pastor persona lately, and trying to figure out, because now I'm not a pastor anymore. I lost my job. I kind of never want to be a pastor again, but that's probably what I'm going to end up doing because I don't know what else to do for a living at this stage of my life. But I've been thinking about what I lost, and I've been thinking about that pastor persona. And there's this profile that maybe is not as evident in some traditions, but at least in the environment where I grew up, there's just this profile that pastors have to fit. I can remember taking a class in seminary on life and work of the pastor. It was a good class. I learned a lot of I think, really important lessons. But I can remember a lecture about what kinds of cars it was okay for us to drive if we were going to have a public persona as a pastor. And I don't remember that being a weird thing. I was like, oh, good. Okay, I should buy a Honda Accord. All right, whatever. Because, it can't be too fancy, but it can't be too shabby either. There are seminars for the wives of pastors. How many of you have careers that come with instruction manuals for your spouse? Can you imagine like I don't know, a seminar for the wife of an insurance adjuster? It would just be completely ridiculous. But like, the notion that pastor's spouse, and I'll say pastor's wife, because in my tradition, it's always the pastor's wife, or at least in the tradition where I grew up, like it's a role. And, my ex-wife often says, how ridiculous was it that I was expected to go to work with you one day a week and bring the kids? A friend of mine in the neighborhood, one of my colleagues, Anglican priest, went through a divorce. I think it was a summer or two before I came out, and he had to write this letter to his congregation, and one of his parishioners came and talked to me about it and said, it just seemed so wrong, because how many jobs do you have where if you're going through something really personal, you have to write a letter to explain it to all your colleagues? These are just things that we assume it's just the way being a pastor is going to be. I can remember in the early days of that life and work at the pastor class being told, you got to have thick skin because your church, and the subtext was because your church will abuse you, and oh well. And you're going to lose your private life by going into pastoral ministry. So you have to create this persona, and it's not real. It's not human. It's a persona. And I spent 20, 30 years working on that. Part of it is starting a family. Part of it is being the young, like quote unquote man of God with a wife and 2 kids. Because if you're married and you have kids, you're going to get a job over a person who's not married and doesn't have kids, because churches want those extra people and they want somebody that can attract young families. And I remember once being on an ad hoc scholarship committee for my denomination and reviewing a couple of different transcripts. And I looked at the transcript of a young woman. The worst grade she had ever made in 4 years of a bachelor's degree and 3 years of a master's of divinity was an A-. And I can remember hearing people describe this young woman to me as a really lousy minister because she just didn't fit the profile. I mean, you kind of know what they meant, but there's this persona. I chose to build that persona very carefully for, like I said, about 30 years, from when I was 11 years old and preached my first sermon until I came out at 41. I don't know that I'm grieving the loss of that persona so much as I am angry at myself for dedicating so much of my life and so much of my energy to maintaining it. But that's kind of where I am right now. I also recognize that as somebody who had that kind of, public facing job, and as somebody working in a Baptist church where conversations about LGBTQ plus inclusion just don't happen very often. If I came out the way I did in a sermon, that I could generate a lot of conversation. Working back a little bit, at some point, I was 35 when I moved to Canada. I had been serving in Richmond, Virginia, and kind of wanted to get away from the southern United States where everybody's a Baptist and being Baptist doesn't mean anything. So I came to Mississauga, Ontario, where there are very few Baptist churches. And if you want to go to a Baptist church, you kind of have to really be determined to go to a Baptist church. And after a year or two of moving here, my oldest kid had started playing hockey, which I was really excited about. I was into hockey as a kid, but I grew up in the middle of nowhere in Western North Carolina. And because the Ontario Hockey Federation, I think, had lost a human rights case a couple of years prior, they required parent volunteers to take a webinar on understanding discrimination on the basis of gender, gender identity, sexual orientation. I was the team manager that year. I wasn't a non-ice coach. I was just like the parent who managed the snack calendar and booked the hotel for the out of town tournaments and stuff like that. But I took this webinar, and for the first time in my life, I had, in kind of a systematic way, the concept of gender identity as opposed to like assigned sex or gender presentation explained to me. And I pretty intentionally avoided learning about this stuff, and would have told you right up until I was about 39 years old, I'm a cisgender man who just really wants to be a woman and has always really wanted to be a woman. But you know, that's silly. I'll grow out of it eventually. I don't know when I thought I was going to grow out of it, because I was pushing 40 at this point. By the end of that hockey season, when I had taken that webinar, I was so troubled. One day I left my office at the church, got in my car, drove into the gay village in Toronto, Church and Wellesley, to the Glad Day bookstore, which is the oldest queer bookstore in North America. And I walked in tears and said to like a clerk there, I have questions about my gender identity. What do you think I should be reading? And they made a few suggestions, but then they could see that I was just a mess. You know, I looked very different. It was April 13th, Friday, April 13th, 2018. And they said, well, the 519, the LGBTQ community center, is just up the block. You should go in there and talk to somebody about getting in to see a therapist. And so I did. A couple of weeks later, I had a therapy intake appointment. A couple of weeks after that, I was connected with a regular therapist. A couple of weeks after that, my therapist was calling me she and her and Alexandria, which was the name I was experimenting with back then. A couple of weeks after that, I was going to therapy, presenting female. A couple of weeks after that, I was coming out to friends. And I guess a couple of weeks after, of course, by then, you know, I kind of entered this double life phase, which went on for the better part of 2 years. I recognized that there were pretty much no examples of trans women pastors coming out to their congregations that kept their job. There are a couple of trans women pastors. There's a trans woman interim Anglican priest just down the road in Niagara Falls, Penny Anderson, actually. I didn't know she was there till I came out. She reached out to me. I'm told there's about 300 trans clergy in North America, but then I've also been told there's 30 trans clergy in North America. So I have no idea who to believe there. When you narrow it down to trans women who are senior pastors of churches, I don't think it's more than 5 or 10, honestly, maybe less. So I didn't have a lot to learn from. I didn't have very many women. I didn't know very many women at the time that I could connect with. But I just saw that, you know, these folks don't get to keep their jobs. I wasn't ready to lose my job. I wasn't ready to go into that like financial, to face those financial problems. And anyway, my church was beginning to celebrate its 100th anniversary. We were founded sometime between May of 1919 and May of 1920. So we spent from May of 2019 to May of 2020 celebrating our centennial. And part of what I said was, whether my church accepts me or not, it's going to be a big deal when I come out, at least to the church. And so let's get this celebration out of the way. And then as we step into our second century of ministry, here's this uniquely 21st century thing to think about. And that gave me a chance to go to more therapy, get started on hormone replacement therapy, change doctors, get in with a doctor that kind of knew his way around trans healthcare, make friends in the Toronto trans community. One of the neat things about Toronto is that, you know, if I were a small town pastor somewhere living part-time as a woman and part-time as a man, it would have been very complicated. But there's like 7 million people in Toronto. I never ran into anybody I knew. And it was actually you know, when I finally was ready to come out in June, I'd had a lot of experience just kind of being out in the world. And so I could do all this stuff and start building kind of a network of support. COVID changed my plans a little bit, but not by a whole lot. I had originally planned to come out on June the 7th, 2020. I came out on June the 14th. The way COVID changed things was that the day after we had our first live streamed worship service, March the 15th, and at the end of that service said, we can't do it like that anymore. We're just going to have to do it by Zoom. So everybody's going to have to stay home. The next day, I went out and got my ears pierced. And I think of that day as kind of when I socially transitioned, because from that day forward, I really only pretended to be a boy on Zoom calls for church, because I never saw anybody for months. And it was a bit awkward by the time I came out. And in fact, some of the media interviews I did, they said, they asked if that was the first time I was presenting female in my coming out sermon. And I was like, no, that was me presenting male, actually. And they were like, really? And I said, yeah, I'm afraid so. That's just the best I could do at that point. I also realized that by giving the sermon on YouTube, I had the opportunity to connect with people who might not otherwise hear a sermon from a trans pastor, a kid whose parents go to a conservative church, or maybe not even a conservative church, but just a church that's not open and affirming, kids questioning their faith, just any trans kid or trans person that needed to hear a pastor say, God sees you as you are, God loves you as you are, God calls you by name, even if you don't know what that name is yet, even if nobody else called you by that name. And I also came out the way that I came out to get a lot of attention. One of the last books I read before I came out was called The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls by Mona El-Tahawy. She's an Egyptian American activist, and she takes these 7 behaviors or attitudes that women and girls are socialized not to model. And one of those is attention. One of the worst things, supposedly, that you can say about a woman is, oh, she just wants attention. But then you have to ask yourself, well, who makes rules about who is deserving of attention and who benefits from the enforcing of those rules? And so I realized that if I could look my congregation in the eye with the whole world potentially looking on and say, this is who I am, the ball is in your court. You can keep me, you can not keep me, but I'm not leaving. Then they would have to look me in the eye, presumably in front of the whole world also, and say, here's our decision. Often, non-affirming churches, and lots of churches that make kind of questionable decisions, like to hide behind a lack of transparency. One of the big mega churches here in the Toronto area has a pastor who likes to say, we're a conservative church. We don't necessarily support marriage equality, but we want to love people so much that they think we're a liberal church. And I'm like, how dishonest and insidious is that? But that's the way a lot of churches are. My church had on the sign out front and in the bulletins every week, all are welcome. And I knew that if I came out the way I did, we could field test that. And it turns out they weren't being honest. I spent 5 weeks after coming out on the hot seat. I wasn't allowed to preach anymore after that, and I wasn't really given a good answer as to why. And but I had to answer a lot of questions. It was very difficult. In some cases, it felt kind of dehumanizing. I tried not to let it get to me, but it's still, you know, there's some anger, there's some resentment. And then a vote was held on July the 20th. And the folks who wanted to fire me won by 5 votes, 58 to 53. That was July 20th. I had a sermon lined up to preach on July 26th, and I've preached just about every Sunday since. I'm astounded that churches keep finding me and reaching out to me. But that's what I'm doing right now. I don't really know what comes next. Like I said, this is all so new to me. I have to remind myself June, you haven't even really been at this a year full time yet. So you got to give yourself some grace. I think sometimes people see me and they assume that I've been doing this longer, or that I'm not really newly transitioned, and so maybe they make some assumptions based on that. And part of that's because I had such a long, like almost 2 years of living that kind of double life phase, which everybody said, the double life phase is the hardest. And then now everybody's saying, well, the first year is the hardest. So I'm like, for crying out loud, people, like, when is it not going to be the hardest anymore? And in terms of my faith, that's a really interesting question. I think after all that talk about how pastors don't get to be human beings, you can kind of discern my opinion of churches and the way they dehumanize clergy just by default. I kind of never want to go to church again. I kind of never want to be a pastor again. But I also realize that the best chance I've got of paying my rent is going to church and being a pastor. So I don't really know what to do. I feel kind of trapped. But starting next year, I'll probably get a job in another church, because what else am I going to do at this stage in my life, at this age of my life? And it's funny, I talk to so many other clergy, most of them cis, who say, if I could do something else with my life, I would. But I'm in my 30s, I'm in my 40s, I'm in my 50s. Nobody's going to pay me to do as much to do something else as what I'm doing now. And it's kind of sad, honestly. I'm starting to get to know queer clergy at affirming churches. And that's kind of scaring me in a way. I think, well, gosh, it sounds just as politically messed up. It sounds like the personality issues are the same. It sounds like the arguments are the same. Just because you don't happen to be homophobic and you don't happen to be transphobic, it kind of doesn't sound all that different or all that much better than the church that fired me, or the church before that, or the church before that. So I think I'm dealing with some trauma, and I don't know where I'm going to land. The way I often put it, the way I would often describe or categorize my faith these days is that not even the church can make me stop believing in the reconciliation of all things. And if the church can't do it, if the church can't sour my belief on the reconciliation of all things, then probably nothing can. I see a lot of myself in the stories of other trans people in healing narratives in scripture. I'm so drawn to those. I see myself in this story of the Exodus. And in fact, the day I started estrogen, I got a tattoo with the Hebrew inscription from Isaiah 43 that says, "The one who makes a way through the sea." And it's on my hip, which is where God touched Jacob when God said, your identity as Jacob doesn't make sense to me anymore, so you're going to be Israel from now on, because God likes to change people's identities. And that idea of crossing over, the God who makes a way to cross over the sea, that I said a blessing on that day that I found online. It's a Hebrew blessing for gender transition, and I have to pull it up because my Hebrew is awful. But oh gosh, where did it go? Here it is. It goes, you're gonna love this with a Southern accent. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam ha'ma'avir et ha'ovrim. And that means, blessed are you, eternal one, our God, ruler of time and space, the transforming one to those who transition, or the giver of transition to the transitioning ones. And that word that means the transitioning ones or the crossing over ones is like avir. And the crossing over ones are ivrim, and that's the word Hebrew in Hebrew. So even today in like modern Hebrew, the word for transgender and the word for Hebrew come from the same root. Because just as we tell the story of faith of God's people crossing from like slavery into freedom, from like darkness and the light from like the really dangerous side of the sea through the sea to the other side. Transgender people get to cross over too, and experience that transformation, experience that healing. The thing I'm finding, and where it connects to, I think, Trans Day of Remembrance and the just heart-wrenching stories that come out of this week, is if you read the stories of healing in the New Testament, they always make people mad. Every time, well, most of the most serious plotting to get rid of Jesus happens the moment he's healed somebody. And last Sunday I preached on when Jesus said to Lazarus, "Lazarus, come out," and Lazarus came out, and all of a sudden, by the end of that chapter, John chapter 11, there's a group of people like plotting deliberately and very intentionally to kill Jesus. And within a couple of verses, they're also plotting to kill Lazarus. There's something about walking in newness of life that unfortunately makes a lot of people angry, that makes them lash out. I think there's something about the light that trans people bear that makes folks who love the darkness want to put us out. So it's just I don't know. I don't know if that was a particularly organized stream of consciousness, but that's kind of where I am right now. And it is such an honor this early in my journey to be given a chance to kind of give a bit of a story about where I'm at and where I'm headed. So thank you.
Thank you, June, so much. Yeah, again, so much I'd love to say, and I'm sure many of us would, but let's again just take a moment to take in your story and prayerfully accept it with gratitude. Let's take a moment in stillness. So again, thank you to all three of you for, there's so many adjectives I could use, but just the power of hearing your stories. We just have about 5 or 10 minutes left before we need to kind of close down here. The first thing I wanted to do, and it became more apparent as I heard your stories, is perhaps not in terms of age, but at least in terms of coming out and transitioning. There's a few generations, there's very different experiences, and yet some similarities. And I just wanted to give any of you, if you want, an opportunity to respond to each other's stories. It doesn't have to be in depth or anything, but is there anything that you heard or experienced, and it could be directed at all three or at one person, or so again, remember to unmute yourself, but is there something that in hearing the stories together that you wanted to kind of reflect on to each other?
I want to say to June, I have a tattoo, I guess, I don't know if you can see it, on my arm, which is Isaiah 43:19. When you said Isaiah 43, I was like, no way. Yeah,
Very beautiful.
that's Hebrew and English also. So
yeah, it's quite beautiful. So much of that chapter and so much of that part of the Bible.
yeah, I love Isaiah.
Yeah. I got the prescription. It took me 7 months to get the prescription because it's just so hard to, I mean, on one hand, like Canadian healthcare is wonderful in that like it makes transition related care available to people, but like, you know, I spent a lot of time on social media connected to other trans people, and like American trans people, like they become self-accepting and they start hormones like 2 weeks later. I'm like, how did you do that? And it was from January to August. It took me to finally get on estrogen. And so when I finally got that prescription, I went and picked up the box. They were patches at first, and before I put the first patch on, I went and got a tattoo, and then I went and stood in Lake Ontario and said that Hebrew prayer and put the first patch on, and yeah, that was a happy day.
I guess another thing I would like to comment on, it saddens me that as much as things have changed, that it's still so difficult. That really makes me sad, particularly vis-a-vis, well, everything really. But I mean, I love the Anglican Church of Canada. And like I said, I'm in a really, I think it is probably the most progressive diocese in the world, but it still feels like, you know, that there's so much to do.
Can I ask the two of you a question? I've just become pretty good friends with a trans man here in Toronto, and we've just been hanging out, and we'll probably do some Trans Day of Remembrance stuff together. We inevitably end up kind of comparing notes, and it seems to me from talking to him that pre-transition trans men in youth have a little bit more leeway to express masculinity as assigned female people than I would have had as an assigned male to express femininity. And sometimes that can make you a target in ways that I don't think I was ever targeted. I don't think I was ever an especially like effeminate kid because I knew better. And so I guess the question there is, does that make sense to you? Is that something that you've observed, or yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. It comes back to patriarchy. When you're going from male to female, you're giving up the privilege, and there's just something about that that really really hits to the heart of the patriarchy in some way that I have never figured out. But it's, in my experience, absolutely true that people who are assigned female have much more latitude to be tomboys and express masculine. Maybe it's because you're assuming the privilege, you know, you're assuming the more powerful position, and people can understand that in our power obsessed culture. But it's definitely been my experience hugely. Not to say that trans, you know, the other way, there's been obviously murders and rapes and terrible violence, but there is something about going from female to male that it's very different. You want to say anything, Danny?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of add to that, like when you talked about the opposite, because I've noticed from transitioning from female to male, one of the things I've lost is that connection with children. For example, I was at a counseling session and it was right beside my son's preschool. They're in middle school now. And I was waving at one of the teachers and looking at all the kids, and the teacher came over and she kind of looked at me, "Oh, it's you, Danny," because they perceive me as male, which that's great. but now I'm like a danger to the children. So I lost something by crossing over. Does that make sense, Brynn? Have you noticed that?
Absolutely. Like walking down a street at night, if there's a woman, the women will look at you as a risk.
Yeah.
Also, it's very interesting because even in our society that says so often that they want sensitive feeling men, I found that when you are a sensitive feeling man, it makes people uncomfortable, even some of the same people who say that they want that. That was a real eye-opener to me. Like, it's still, it does make even feminist women uncomfortable often if you are perceived as vulnerable or not, like kind of not in charge, not able to manage things. And I don't think people are even aware of it. It took me a long time to figure out that I think that's what's going on.
Well, and also my superpower now is I'm in a men's group, and I'm usually the person that gets choked up and is teary. And now in my men's group, the men are typically weeping, and they're crying with me, and they're all appreciating me being vulnerable. So, it's a superpower. It's both, like a gift and a curse.
There's just so many ways that gender damages both sides, really. Not gender, but the stereotypical gender expectations that really human beings generally don't conform to. And when you don't conform in a way, there's pressure on you to conform to it. And when you don't, or you can't, I mean, almost everybody I've ever come out to, well, more, years ago, but I don't know if it happens to people now as much, but they would share ways that they just felt really uncomfortable in their own gender. Not that they wanted to be the other gender, but just ways that never seemed to fit them. Like you say, expressing their feelings, or there's so many ways that people are constrained by these gender roles that often do come back to a certain hierarchy and power structure that's enforced, We could have a whole discussion about these sorts of things.
Yeah.
I
think it's fascinating.
More interesting.
Yeah, we were talking recently, his name's Nick, and I, about how, even when he was living as kind of a very like masculine presenting woman, like people still looked at him because like people look at women, and now people don't really look at him, and he's like, why don't people look at me? And meanwhile, I'm walking down the street like, why is that person looking at me? Like, and I honestly, sometimes I don't know, like, are they like looking to see how tall I am? Do they maybe think I'm pretty, or are they like clocking me as trans, or like, and it just, it's a strange feeling that I never experienced in quite that way. And it can make me uncomfortable in the same way that he's kind of uncomfortable that he feels very invisible now.
So there's, thank you again, all of you. There's a few notes in the chat here, mostly sincere thanks coming from a number of different folks, and especially to the three of you for telling the stories, your stories, and again, with such intentionality and vulnerability and openness, when we're kind of spread across this disconnected divide of Zoom, to actually be able to share in the way you did. I'm really grateful. And my hope, my sincere hope is that this is the beginning of an ongoing conversation. We at AbbeyChurch we've wanted to get Danny's story told more widely, and we've been talking about that for a while now. So this was one way to do this, but with with Trans Day of Remembrance coming up later this week, we thought this would be an opportunity to share some of the stories. And that even as I kind of heard some of your stories and read Brynn's beforehand, somebody, I don't even know where the quote comes from, but one of the great arguments for God's mercy is the continued existence of the church on earth. And hearing the trauma in all of your lives, actually, that the church has caused, as a person who has a love-hate relationship with the church, but is of the church, there's not enough apologizing or enough that can be said about that, except for the hope, as I think Brynn said, that this isn't just an issue to be, that one day this isn't, there's hopefully more interesting issues, I think is how Brynn put it. Not that this is not interesting and so deeply important, but that we can move beyond this to beyond the like this as an issue into the depth of the fullness of the body of Christ together as people. And so, I mean, that may sound kind of idealistic, but I'm hopeful in hearing your stories, and grateful. And I do hope we can continue this conversation and in some form in the weeks and years to come, because it really is rich. And I'm glad we did record this. I'm not sure what we'll do with it, but I'm so deeply touched and moved by the spirituality, by the resilience in face of so much pain and struggle and strength and spiritual strength that's come through. That's been really evident to me in the stories. So so thanks to everyone. I think the link, June has put the link in the chat for the coming out sermon. And June, you have your own YouTube. Is it YouTube? I think it's YouTube. I've watched a few of your sermons. I think they were on YouTube or
Yeah. So I almost always post the sermons that I give wherever they are. Like this Sunday, I'm preaching for University Baptist Church in Austin, Texas, and I'll post a video of that at some point. And yeah, Pastor June is my website, and right now, guest preaching is okay, but it's not. It doesn't. I don't make an income, like a livable income, that way. So some clergy friends of mine in the States started a GoFundMe, and right now that's my pride. That's kind of how I pay my rent and feed my kids. And so like there's a link to the GoFundMe on my website, Pastor June, and people always kind of ask, well, how can we support you? And I'm like, well, if you would buy me a cup of coffee, give me $10 on GoFundMe, because it sure would go a long way.
So yeah, please do consider supporting, listening, watching sermons, inviting June to come preach at your community of faith. So yeah.
And I thank you for putting this together, and also thank everybody who came tonight, who had enough interest in the topic, because it's also gratifying that people in the church, not that I'm assuming everyone here is involved in the church necessarily, but it is gratifying that people want to hear about this, because it gives me hope that we can change it also. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Rob, for putting it together.
Thank you. Thank you all for putting yourselves and your stories in such a public forum. We do have to transition. I wish we had more time for group conversation. It would be a bit intimidating to moderate with a group of almost 40 people, with who's in the house here and who's on the screen. But we have to run because we're doing evening Compline here in the space at 9 o'clock. So we need to light candles and get the incense going and things like that. But in the meantime, huge gratitude to everybody who joined us. Please do drop a line. I will, I think the closing word in the chat, Rob has said, not me, another Rob has said, I've never understood so clearly the relationship between pain and suffering and the transition to honest spiritual faith. Isaiah 43 for sure, praise God. So indeed, we leave with the praise of God on our tongues tonight in gratitude for your stories and prayers for your ongoing ministry. And even though Danny isn't sort of officially or formally in ministry, I see him ministering. So thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Many thanks. Good night, all.
Thank you so much.
Rob, do you need us to stick around at all?
To transition quickly. So I'll write an email or be in touch with you soon. But thank you again. Thank you so much, all of you. God bless.
Bye-bye, Danny. Stay in touch.
Yes, yes. Oh, you have my email, both of you.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Take care.